Welcome, UCL fans, to our Season 2 Week 11 review and ranking for the United Championship League. I'm your host, Fanatic64. I know this is a little bit later than what I normally do, but I've been out all day. I've had work the last several days, and I'm finally able to actually sit down and do this recording. For those that have heard already, I'm getting married this weekend, so I haven't really had time to sit down and do a lot of recording. And when it comes to UCL stuff, it's kind of hard to, unlike a lot of other people that will get recorded and do like gameplay stuff, I can't really sit and bulk record a bunch of stuff for stuff that's coming out on the day of my wedding. So, next week's videos will probably also be late if I even get them up at all, but I will at least try to get a preview video up for week 12. But we're not here to talk about week 12, we're here to talk about week 11. So, let's go ahead and just start going through this. First matchup, we had the South Beach Slow Kings 2-8 taking on the Grand Canyon Greninjas, who were 1-9, and it was a one. This one was a complicated one. They got disconnected part of the way through. They restarted the match, but only brought 3 Mons each, the ones that were the most alive. So I mean, overall, it looks like a 4-1 victory on it, but it came down to being like a 3-0 in the set when they restarted on it. So it's really hard to say. But it was a win for the Grand Canyon Greninjas. The MVP of the match was the Mega Charizard X from the Grand Canyon Greninjas, who did manage to get 3 knockouts this week. Moving on into our second matchup. This actually did not take place. Tulsa Town Flames, Philadelphia for Alligators. I've tried reaching out to I've been trying to reach out to like either of the coaches, try and figure out what happened. My guess is that one of them were just unable to be prepared or might be out. I won't know which one actually will consider taking the loss in this one until the matchups for it. So if I was to guess based upon the history, Tulsa Town Flames probably took the loss, given the win for Alligators, but we don't know for sure. I'm gonna hopefully keep trying to get more answers before I do my preview video for Friday on it. But this match, unfortunately, did not take place this week. Moving on into our third matchup, we had the Manchester Magnazones at 5-5, taking on the Long Island Reggie Rockies, who were 3-7. And it was a 4-0 victory for the Manchester Magnazones. The MVP of the match was actually Sneasel from the Manchester Magnazones, managing to get 3 knockouts this week. Moving on into our fourth matchup, we had the Newcastle Nido Kings, who are 4-6, taking on the Bristol City Blazekins, who are 5-5. Just trying to turn my page here, and it was a 3-0 victory for the Bristol City Blazekins. MVP of the match was Spiritomb from the Bristol City Blazekins, who did manage to get 3 knockouts this week. In our fifth matchup, we have the Toronto Togekids, who are 4-6, taking on the Tucson Terrakions, who are 5-5, and it was a 5-0 victory for the Tucson Terrakions. MVP of the match was the Chestnut. Oop, I put that all on the wrong side. Just there. Chestnut from the Tucson Terrakions, who managed to get 3 knockouts this week for him. All right, and get those. Moving on to our sixth matchup, which had some playoff contentions in the way for the Pittsburgh Pichus. We had the Bronx Bearticks, who were 8-2, taking on those Pittsburgh Pichus, and it was a 5-0 victory for the Bronx Bearticks. MVP of the match goes to Snorlax from the Bronx Bearticks, who did manage to get 3 knockouts this week. And then these next 2 matchups were our hype matches, just because they were both big and a lot of hype behind them. A lot of stuff involving playoffs as well with it that I couldn't just give one to another. So the first of our hype matches that we had were the Real Moril taking on the St. Louis Rampardos. St. Louis Rampardos they're in 5th place right now going into this matchup. A win would help solidify them into getting at least tied for 4th place on it, with another matchup being later on between him and the other 4th place team. However, it was a 1-0 victory for the Real Moril. The MVP of the match goes to the Megalodios from the Real Moril, who managed to get 3 knockouts this week. And then our other hype match that we had were the Carolina Kildeos at 8-2, taking on the Durham Druddigons, who were 9-1. Carolina Kildeos currently in 4th place, and in a must-win situation to try and maintain that first or fourth place and try and make it into the playoffs. However, it was a 3-0 victory for the Durham Druddigons. MVP of the match goes to the Mega Blastoise from the Durham Druddigons, who did manage to pick up 3 knockouts this week. So now we're going to go ahead and take a look at the rankings for, at least the rankings that I have them for. So as we can see here, we have the Tulsa Town Flames, and the Philadelphia for Alligators. Without them having a match, I just kept their records the same for it. So Tulsa Town Flames are 1-9 now, 16th place, -15 for a differential. South Beach Slow Kings 2-9 and a -23 in a differential. Grand Canyon Greninjas 2-9 and a -20 differential. Again, I kind of spoke on this. Philadelphia for Alligators, they could potentially be up a spot in this, but without knowing who ended up winning the matchup, we were just going to put them at 13th right now. So 3-7 with a -18. Long Island Reggie Rockies are 3-8 with a -16 differential. Toronto Toka Kiss 4-7 and -11. 10th place we have the Newcastle Nido Kings 4-7 with a -10 differential. Ninth place, which still, like, a lot of these teams could still potentially make playoffs if St. Louis Rampardos, Carolina Killdeers lose the next several weeks on it. So, like, St. Louis Rampardos would have to lose at least 3 matchups. Carolina Killdeers would have to lose 4 matchups in the remaining, they have week 12, 13, 14. So, trying to think this out real quick, because Carolina Killdeers, if they were to lose 3, I'll talk about it more afterwards. But we'll get into this. Tucson Terrakion 6-5, -1. Tie for 7th place between Manchester Magnuzones and the Pittsburgh Pichus. 6-5 records with a positive 3 differential. Bristol City Blaziken 6-5 and a positive 6 on the differential. St. Louis Rampardos 7-4, still in 5th place, positive 5 in the differential. Carolina Killdeers kind of in a no-lose situation for the remainder of the season, 8-3, positive 12 differential. Bronx Bearticks continue at 9-2, positive 14. Durham Druddigons, Real Maril, top of the chain once again for it. Again, by standard UCL rules, Durham Druddigons should be first place for it, just because they defeated the Real Maril during their matchup for the rest during the regular season. If the Carolina Killdeers, they can lose one more match this season and still potentially make playoffs, but they cannot lose to the St. Louis Rampardos. The St. Louis Rampardos also cannot lose a match if they want to actually maintain playoff status. So it's really, playoffs, Real Maril, Durham Druddigons, Bronx Bearticks, clinch playoffs. There's like no way that they could, unless they actually lose. Like, the Bronx Bearticks would have to lose the last 4 weeks and have any of the teams that are 6-5 win all of their matchups for it, or at least have St. Louis Rampardos and Carolina Killdeers win the rest of their matchups to still, to be kicked out of it. Durham Druddigons, Real Maril, basically guaranteed playoffs. Bronx Bearticks, still kind of, are all but guaranteed if they win next week. Definitely guaranteed playoff spots, because there would be no way that they could possibly be taken out of playoff contention. Carolina Killdeers, St. Louis Rampardos, both in a kind of a wild card situation. Carolina Killdeers have, like I said, these last several weeks are going to be the toughest battles for Carolina, and of course they do have to take on the St. Louis Rampardos. So if St. Louis defeats the Carolina Killdeers, even if Carolina wins the remainder of the matchups and only loses to St. Louis Rampardos will then take over and become in 4th place and move on to the playoffs. If the St. Louis Rampardos lose at least one more matchup, though, assuming Carolina only loses one other matchup, but defeats the St. Louis Rampardos, the Carolina Killdeers will move on into playoffs. So this is like closer than season 1 was, I feel, as far as like who's going to potentially make it. I mean, 4th place was still between 3 teams as well, and there's still potential that if St. Louis Rampardos lose another one, but let's say Tucson Terracons, Manchester Magnazones, Pittsburgh Peaches, Bristol City Blazekins win their matchup. Carolina Killdeers lose theirs. Carolina still has to try and win remainder of his matchups. If the St. Louis Rampardos lose 2, Carolina Killdeers lose 3 of the next matchups because there are about 4 weeks left, if I remember, because we have 12, 13, 14. Yeah, there's 4 weeks left, so one more month left in regular season. If Carolina loses all 4 of the remaining matchups, they'll go from 8-3 to 8-7 and be taken out. If St. Louis Rampardos manage to lose most of their, like if they lose 2 more matchups, any of the teams that are 6-5, assuming Carolina loses at least the next 3, it's very complicated. It's potentially a lot of the teams who are even 6-5, assuming that Carolina Killdeers lose at least 3 matchups, St. Louis Rampardos have to lose at least 2 matchups, and then there's a potential for any of the upper teams to make it. So Manchester Magnazones, they defeated the Pittsburgh Peaches. I don't remember if they took on Tucson or not. I'd have to look back through my notes for it, but I mean, if let's say it came down to if there was a tie between Manchester and Pittsburgh, for 4th place because St. Louis and Carolina lost too many matchups and they continued winning them, Manchester Magnazones could move on to the playoffs considering they defeated the Pittsburgh Peaches earlier in the season. So the teams from 9th place up, very unlikely, and it all depends on what happens over the course of the next at least 2 to 3 weeks on it. Because like I said, if Carolina wins at least the next 2 weeks and St. Louis loses at least one of those, as long as Carolina does not lose to the St. Louis Rampardos, or no, rather, if Carolina loses at least 2 of the last 4 weeks, and the St. Louis Rampardos only loses 1, as long as that 1 is not to the Carolina Killdeers, St. Louis Rampardos will move on to the playoffs. If Carolina Killdeers lose all their matchups and the St. Louis Rampardos lose at least 3 matchups, even 2 matchups, and any of the teams from 9th to 6th place win the rest of their weeks, one of them could be in playoff contention. So it's very close. I definitely recommend we watch all these matches in the next couple weeks to see what's going to happen. Of course, I will try and have up my preview for Week 12, and as I said at the beginning, probably won't have my review of Week 12 up. If I do have one up, it's probably going to go up either late Wednesday or potentially even Thursday for it. So, but winning's a little bit more important than me trying to get these up there. As much as I would love to get these up, I've got to go get married for it. So, but thank you all very much for those who have watched all the way through with this. Let me know who of those top 9 teams, or even between worst case scenario, what teams do you want to see make playoffs that still have the potential for playoff contention? Let me know down below. But otherwise, I will see you all on Friday with our with our Week 12 review or preview video. That's what I'm trying to say for it. But thank you all very much for those who have watched. You have yourselves a good time. Take care and goodbye.